on-the-ground restoration topics. We're going to be starting with Arlee Montalvo. Arlee is with the Riverside Corona Resource Conservation District, and she'll be talking about seed sourcing decisions in a changing world.
And I forgot to look at what I'm supposed to be doing here. This is a study that I've been working on with Jan Byers from the Pacific Southwest Research Station with Erin Reardon, who is our postdoc, and she is currently busy in Tucson right now and at a conference, and was supposed to give this talk, so I am doing it. And how do I do this? Do I just go page down, page enter?
You can push these arrows.
Just these, okay, that works.
Does that work? Okay.
Okay, I've been interested in variation in plant taxa across the landscape, across environmental gradients for a long time. And California is one of those spaces where there's just an amazing degree of variation in our topography, in our precipitation, all kinds of different environmental gradients from east to west and north to south, and we have plant taxa that exist across many of these environmental gradients, which are different from place to place in terms of their adaptations and how well they're able to survive in different environments. And because of this, we need to kind of get an idea, get a handle on what some of that variation is like and how that can influence their success. California can be divided into different ecological units, such as for this ecological sections map of California, where the different color blobs represent regions of environmental similarity. And each of those regions can be further subdivided as well to give us clues about what to do with plants. And I'm trying the arrow key and it's not working. Oh, wrong arrow key. Okay, and then, okay, thank you. I'm really inept at these things. So the idea is that careful choice of species and subspecific taxa and seed sources for projects can really help us in terms of minimizing the risk of maladaptation, reducing risks of inbreeding depression and outbreeding depression, can help us preserve biological interactions, maintain genetic variation to provide populations with adaptive potential, and hopefully increase the long-term success of projects. And so what sorts of information have we traditionally used to inform seed use? Well, from very coarse to fine, we have things like those ecoregion maps. And this is just showing a blow up of the Southern California mountains and valleys area, where our section that is further subdivided with lots of different changes in elevation and temperature and rainfall, even within that. We can look at species distributions and relate where they occur across the landscape in terms of their environmental requirements and soil, different kinds of climate and soil affinities. We can look at plant traits and the association of different kinds of traits with maladaptation risk or their adaptive capacity. We can do very elaborate studies, common garden studies, such as this one, which was done, or a series of common garden studies done by Jessica Pratt, Kaylin Mooney, and Sheng at UC Irvine, where they planted many different populations of California sagebrush, Artemisia californica, into common gardens to look at where are there genetic differences versus just differences in plasticity in populations coming from different areas. And they did water addition experiments to get at that plasticity question. There are molecular genetic studies that give us an idea about how populations are connected in space in terms of their relationships, their genetic relationships, and how differentiated the populations are over space. And these sorts of data can be put together to give us some idea about taxon-specific seed transfer guidelines. There have been some very general tools that were put together when we don't have a lot of information about species, and many of our shrubland taxa have not been studied in great deal in terms of their genetics or their variation in space. There's these provisional seed zones were put together just based on a few variables, minimum temperature and an aridity index, and we can see a blow up of our Southern California area over there on the right. And that's identifying areas that share certain climatic variables. And the idea was, in the absence of information, this is just a starting point where one can start thinking about how one might restrict movement. But do these zones really make sense for our California taxa, especially shrubland taxa? Are they too big? Are they too small? And then how much, what about the changes that are occurring in these zones with climate change? Climate change, we think, is a restoration game changer. It's not really a question. We really have to think about it. Aaron just put this together to show how there are climatic shifts, just looking at two different climate change scenarios, where the black points in the graphs below in the principal components analysis show the separation of the black points, which would be the baseline condition, compared to a mid-century projection, where a hotter, wetter environment, the blue, or a hotter, drier environment, the red. And then we can just see how those curves, the individual points, separate out in space, and compared to baseline, where you can see that at the top, on the top graph, the minimum winter temperatures are increasing for both of those climate projections. But if you look at the bottom, the precipitation is increasing slightly over baseline, the black baseline for the blue, but for the red, a large decrease. So we have, we've heard over and over again, we have observed shifts already in our climate. This is just comparing two 30-year periods, looking at the change in 3 climate variables, just for illustration, in the Southern California region. We can see that temperature minima have already changed. If you look at the orange for the graph, the picture on the left, the dark orange is where the largest change has occurred. Okay, so you can see that it's not uniform through the landscape, that we change depending on where you are. Okay, and that's important to think about. Precipitation, change in precipitation in some areas it has increased, in other places it's decreased. But when you look at climatic water deficit, that think of that as an indication of drought stress, where we can see that climatic water deficit has actually increased almost everywhere across that range. And if we look at climatic water deficit and project into the future, based on 5 different climate scenarios, which are what we used in some modeling that we did that I'll be showing you in a minute. We used the resource concentration pathway of 8.5, which is thought of as the business as usual, where we're really not doing a good job on our emissions. And we can see that there's a great deal of variation depending on which model. And this is just driving that thought home, that we do have to be concerned with different projections and different models. So seed sourcing for the future, what do we need to do? I mean, how do we think about it? Well, we can identify climate vulnerabilities for all kinds of taxa, one at a time. So what is the projected climate stress, or the projected exposure to climate change at any particular place for a particular species? And what do a taxon's traits, the traits that it's possessed, tell us about its ability to deal with the changes in place, or their ability to migrate, seed dispersal, pollen dispersal, sharing genes amongst different populations. We also need to consider the risks of moving things too soon. You don't want them to die. You move them, way ahead of time, or produce growth phase mismatches with their pollinators or other herbivores and so on. We don't want to create problems with outbreeding depression or unanticipated changes in community interactions. And we also need to really think about those other risk factors, the fire risk and land use changes. There are some tools out there that the tree people are using, okay, the Forest Service. There's a collaborative effort between Pacific Northwest Research Station, the Conservation Biology Institute, and Oregon State University, where they produced this really cool seed lot selection tool that helps them match seed lots to particular places on the ground while looking at projected climate change scenarios. And also, while what's cool about this tool is that you can very flexibly designate particular climate variables, and you can designate constraints. So if you know that your taxon is super susceptible to negative water potentials of -4 or of 4, you can potentially put in a constraint that might help you understand, but that requires expert knowledge about those taxa. So anyway, just getting back to what we're doing, because I didn't do that. So Aaron ran these species distribution models on 36 of our shrubland taxa from lower elevation chaparral, 44 taxa total, where we're relating the species occurrences based on herbarium and survey data to climate variables and soil variables to project a baseline habitat suitability based on a range of years of 1951 to 1980 compared to projections into the future based on 5 different climate scenarios. And that way, let's see if we can get back to this. So we use downscaled climate data. I just have to go through this really quickly. Just wanted to let you see that we used a set of variables that we felt were really important after doing some exploratory analyses to the majority of taxa that we were messing with. And this is just an example for one taxon. This is sugarbush, rusovata, where we are looking at the occurrence data on the left, at the top left with the black dots. And then then we have the baseline habitat suitability projected onto that geographic space, where the dark green is where that's the highest probability of suitable habitat. And then we project into the future. And these maps are showing the range. And this is showing where there's agreement between the 5 models. So that in the future climate, on the top right, we see the dark green is where there's agreement between all 5 models, for example. And in this particular case, we had a range of 85 to 99% of retention of suitable habitat predicted for the future to mid-century. And a very low, a range of 1 to 15% habitat loss and 28 to 55% habitat gain. That doesn't mean that the species can get there, though. There were contrasting patterns, amongst the different species. However, of all those shrub taxa, 75% of the time there was agreement between at least three of the models for habitat suitability retention, which was better than I expected. This is just an example of 3 different species. There are 2 species of Ceanothus on here at the top and the bottom, both of which are obligate cedars after fire. And they occur in different places, and so their habitat suitability really changes. Projected changes really depended on where they sit in the landscape. So you can't make generalizations necessarily about obligate cedars or sprouters. A lot depends about where they actually occur. There are differences in infrataxa that we really need to think about and be concerned about. This is an example from Acnospan glaber. Most of us know it as Lotus scoparius. How many know it as Lotus scoparius? Okay. Okay, so there are 2 varieties. So glaber, which is more coastally aligned, and breviolatus that includes more of the interior sites in Southern California. And we know from common garden studies and other studies that they really are different, very different creatures in terms of their adaptations. These are the results for glaber on the left and breviolatus on the right. And you can see the baseline habitat suitability projections are quite different for the 2, where again, the dark green is mostly toward the west, the coast for glaber, and toward the interior for breviolatus. And when we look at habitat loss for Glaber, all 5 models projected that loss would exceed gain. This is one of those that is projected to have some real problems in the future, in terms of projected suitable habitat loss. Brevulatus, on the other hand, only one of those models projected habitat loss of suitable habitat and a modest gain. So we do really need to look at these as different, potentially very different situations, the subtaxa. There are a number of decision trees, or should say decision frameworks available in the literature that have been very well thought out by very many people to help guide us to think about whether or not we might start moving populations around, doing some assisted migration. And so, but one of the first questions is, is there, a species distribution model available that suggests that taxon is at risk? If it isn't, then you really don't have, much to go on in terms of, I mean, you don't really need to do much. It's taking care of itself potentially, unless fragmentation is a problem. And then you can take this through other ways. And if you answer yes to a bunch of different queries, you can become see that some taxa are candidates for assisted migration, and then you have to make decisions about how you move them. And anyway, those are, we know that different taxa have very different exposures, different resilience, and different vulnerabilities, and we need to think about species traits, what they possess in terms of how they might navigate these changes in the environment. And we can think about what sorts of traits are associated with risks of moving things around. You need to think about dispersal abilities, so different kinds of seed and fruit dispersal abilities. Some are very small dispersal. Some can go thousands of kilometers away by such as heteromeles. Those fruits really move around. We can look at distance guides that were produced by some folks from the Chicago Botanic Gardens, where they talk about when you can relax your conservative local sourcing compared to being more constrained, and what sorts of traits align with a more conservative movement compared to a more relaxed movement. And then there are habitat traits to look at, and taxonomic understanding of the taxa as well. But there are lots of things to consider and to know about the taxa. There are different provenancing models. So once you think you do need to consider how you're moving seeds around, this is a cool one called climate adjusted provenancing. And so if you know that you have a projected increase in aridity in a certain place, and you have a planting site that you need to revegetate, restore, you might consider taking your source populations, collecting your source seeds from different distances away, but within a confined region, within something sensible. Maybe it's within an ecoregion in terms of using those. And so there's a lot of differences among species. We need to know more about them. We need information, and that information is all over the place. So what we've tried to do is combine a lot of information about the ecology and the genetics and the fire response behavior and seed germination and common gardens and everything we can scrub from the literature and from people for easy shopping for information, okay, for alluvial scrubs, shrubs, coastal sage, and chaparral. And we include things like really cool common garden experiments in those profiles. The profiles are what we've done so far, are posted at a website, the RCD website. We welcome any feedback at this point because we still have a chance to change them. We will be updating more, but they include a lot of really useful information. So they are fully referenced. So there's a bibliography and citations for everything that's in there, all about those plants. We include the predictive models for the species distribution modeling efforts that we've done within them. And we provide a summary of the ecological and evolutionary considerations for each taxon that we cover in a profile in terms of seed transfer. And the hope is to create some balance between creating a potential maladapted population with the risk of local extinction. And that's just the website. And I probably am done, right? So I did. Okay. So we think that species distribution modeling can be used with detailed information taken all together in concert to help inform seed decisions when we don't have detailed, seed provenance testing and, seed transfer guidelines. And that these decision frameworks there are decision frameworks that are available that are very useful. I'm hoping to put together a little guidance, paper on the website to help people navigate decision guidelines. We do have, when you have a candidate for assisted migration, it's usually one that has high climate exposure, low gene flow or capacity, highly compromised dispersal. And that this is just showing that the SDM results are going to be available very soon. They're in press in a research report through the Pacific Southwest Research Station. And then the profiles are available